Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. It begins on a normal morning in Greenland, no sirens, no missiles, no ships on the horizon. Then, without warning, screens go dark in Nuuk. Satellite links begin to lag. Secure lines to Copenhagen fail one by one. Radar data arrives seconds late, then minutes. Nothing is visibly wrong, yet the island is no longer fully connected to the world beyond it. No one announces an attack, no border is crossed, but the clock has already started. For the United States, this is the most dangerous kind of crisis, one where the first sign of trouble is not violence, but delay. Because in modern war, losing time is often worse than losing territory, and there is no place where that truth matters more than Greenland. Greenland does not matter because of its size or population. It matters because of geometry. When military planners look at the globe, they do not see continents the way civilians do. They see arcs, trajectories, and reaction windows. And Greenland sits directly beneath the shortest paths that connect North America to Eurasia. For decades, this position gave the United States an advantage. Early warning radar systems across the Arctic were designed to detect threats coming over the pole, buying precious minutes before impact. Greenland functioned as part of that buffer, a silent layer of protection that extended the time available to decide, respond, and survive. That advantage depended on one assumption: that the Arctic was difficult to access and slow to operate in. Ice limited movement. Weather punished persistence. Any sustained presence required enormous effort. As long as those conditions held, Greenland's warning systems were relatively secure by default. That assumption no longer holds. Advances in long-range precision weapons have shortened reaction windows. Persistent satellite surveillance has erased isolation. Melting ice has expanded the seasons in which aircraft and ships can operate in the high north. The Arctic has shifted from a barrier into a corridor. Once that shift occurred, Greenland's role changed fundamentally. If sensors on the island are disrupted, even briefly, warning time collapses. A threat detected minutes later may as well be detected too late. In that gap, decisions are forced under pressure, with fewer options and higher risk. This is why Greenland cannot be treated as just another territory. It is not valuable because it can project power outward. It is valuable because it determines how soon danger is seen. Control of Greenland is control of time. And once warning time becomes uncertain, planners cannot rely on geography alone. They must ask a harder question. If pressure builds around Greenland without a single shot being fired, who actually controls the space when it matters? The danger around Greenland does not announce itself with an invasion. It arrives in fragments, each one deniable, explainable, and easy to ignore on its own. Together they create pressure that reshapes the strategic environment long before anyone admits a crisis exists. From Russia's northern airfields, long-range bombers increasingly fly routes that arc toward the polar corridor. These are not attack runs, they are tests. Each flight measures radar coverage, response speed, and command coordination. Every scramble, every delayed handoff becomes data. The goal is not escalation, but familiarity. On the ground, Russia has quietly restored a network of Arctic bases built during the Cold War. What were once abandoned outposts now host modern air defense systems and electronic warfare equipment. Their purpose is not to seize Greenland, but to complicate the space around it, to interfere with sensors, disrupt tracking, and erode the island's role as an early warning platform. China applies pressure more subtly. Instead of bombers and bases, it sends research vessels and survey teams. Scientific missions map seabeds and ice conditions. Commercial proposals explore mining, ports, and logistics. Each activity is civilian by design, yet each reduces uncertainty about operating in Greenland's environment. Knowledge accumulates quietly. The most sensitive pressure is invisible. Transatlantic data cables run across Arctic waters near Greenland, carrying military, financial, and civilian communications between continents. Surveying these routes is legal and routine, but it also creates a latent capability. In a crisis, interference here would paralyze coordination without a single explosion. None of this crosses a red line. That is precisely why it works. These actions shrink margins without triggering response. They compress warning time while preserving plausible deniability. Greenland remains formally peaceful, even as its strategic reliability erodes. For American planners, this creates an uncomfortable reality. Waiting for a clear act of aggression risks waiting until options are already gone. Pressure that builds quietly is harder to reverse than force that arrives openly. If Greenland's warning role is undermined gradually, restoring it later may require far more drastic action. This is the moment when planning shifts, not because war is inevitable, but because hesitation becomes dangerous. If control over Greenland is slipping without anyone firing a shot, the question is no longer whether to prepare, but how quickly preparation must turn into action. When planners strip away the symbolism and look at Greenland as it actually is, one fact dominates every scenario. There's no force on the island capable of resisting a rapid move, not because Greenland is neglected, but because it was never designed to fight a war. Greenland has no standing military. There is no local army, no air force, no navy waiting to contest airspace or sea lanes. Defense is outsourced by necessity, resting on Denmark's ability to project authority across thousands of miles of ice and ocean. That authority is political first, military second. Denmark's Arctic presence is real but limited. A small, rotating force, patrol aircraft, and naval vessels assert sovereignty and monitor activity. The dog sled patrol, often cited for its endurance, exists to signal governance and awareness, not to delay an advanced military operation. It is a tripwire, not a shield. Geography compounds this imbalance. Greenland has no internal road network. Towns and installations are isolated from one another, connected only by air or sea. There is no depth to trade for time, no interior to fall back into. Control does not spread across land, it jumps between nodes. This creates a strategic vacuum, not a battlefield waiting to be conquered, but an empty space where the first actor to arrive in force defines the situation. Whoever controls the airfields, the ports, and the communications does not just win tactically, they set the terms under which everyone else must respond. For the United States, this reality changes the nature of the problem. The question is no longer whether Greenland could be defended in a prolonged conflict. It is whether it could be secured fast enough to prevent one. In a vacuum, speed replaces strength as the decisive factor. Once that is understood, the logic of an attack plan becomes clearer. If action ever comes, it will not begin with ground combat or territorial conquest. It will begin by closing the vacuum, by acting before anyone else can. Day one begins before dawn in Greenland. There is no alert, no warning broadcast. At first, the disruptions look technical. Satellite feeds lag. Encrypted lines fail to sync. Routine data takes longer to arrive. Then radar screens at local facilities stop updating in real time. What should be continuous becomes intermittent. The source is not on the island. Electronic warfare aircraft operating far beyond Greenland's airspace begin saturating key frequencies. At the same time, specialized satellites reposition overhead, interfering with uplinks and downlinks that tie Greenland to the outside world. The effect is not destruction, but isolation. In Nuuk, communication with Copenhagen becomes unreliable. Messages go through late or not at all. Local authorities cannot confirm whether the problem is regional, technical, or deliberate. That uncertainty spreads faster than any signal. Decision-making slows as each layer waits for clarity from the next. From the outside, nothing appears overtly hostile. There are no troops on the ground, no ships approaching ports. To observers, it could pass as a systems failure or a large-scale exercise. That ambiguity is intentional. It buys time without forcing an immediate political response. Inside the blackout, the balance shifts. Surveillance from beyond the island remains intact, providing a clear picture of air and sea movement. On Greenland itself, awareness degrades. One side sees the environment clearly. The other is forced to guess. This is the opening move of the plan. Before a single aircraft lands or a single runway is seized, the island is cut off just enough to prevent coordination. Greenland is still there, but it is no longer fully connected, and in modern conflict, that separation is often decisive. By the time the blackout is recognized as deliberate, the next phase is already underway. With awareness degraded and response delayed, control of the sky becomes less a challenge and more a matter of timing. Within the first hour, aircraft are already moving. Not toward Greenland cities, but into the airspace above and around the island. Fighters launch from established bases and carrier decks positioned well beyond the horizon. Their presence is not announced. It is implied through radar returns and enforced silence. As Greenland's situational awareness falters, the sky begins to close. Flight plans that would normally pass through Arctic corridors are challenged or rerouted. Surveillance aircraft maintain constant orbits, watching approaches from the Atlantic and the polar routes alike. What was once open airspace becomes controlled space. There is no dogfight, because there does not need to be one. Greenland has no air force capable of contesting control. Danish aircraft are too few and too distant to alter the balance quickly. The decision is not whether to engage, but whether engagement is even possible. By hour 3, the reality is unavoidable. A no-fly condition has effectively formed. Any aircraft entering the zone does so under constant tracking and implicit threat. Control of the air is no longer theoretical, it is procedural. This changes the tempo of everything else. With the sky secured, movement becomes asymmetric. One side can reposition forces freely, the other cannot reliably observe or respond. Reinforcement timelines collapse in one direction and stretch indefinitely in the other. By hour 6, the outcome is settled without a single exchange of fire. Greenland's airspace is no longer neutral. It belongs to whoever arrived first with enough capability to enforce it. From this moment on, the operation is no longer about access. It is about consolidation. With the sky controlled, attention shifts to the ground, not to occupy the island, but to secure the few points that make control permanent. The runways come next. Once the sky is no longer contested, Greenland's vulnerability becomes sharply defined. Control does not depend on cities, territory, or population centers. It depends on a handful of runways capable of supporting sustained airlift. Everything else is secondary. The first priority is the north. Thule Air Base sits at the edge of the polar routes, already embedded within American defense architecture. Securing it is less about capture than confirmation, ensuring uninterrupted access, reinforcing perimeter control, and expanding operational tempo. What already exists is locked in place. The second priority lies inland. Kangerlussuaq's long runway is one of the few on the island capable of handling heavy transport aircraft. Air mobile units move quickly to secure the facility before any attempt can be made to deny its use. Speed matters more than force. The objective is to keep the runway intact. There is no resistance to overcome. Local security forces are not equipped to contest a rapid airborne seizure, and there is no nearby reserve to delay it. By the time the situation is fully understood in Copenhagen, the runways are already operational under new control. Once this happens, the operation crosses a point of no return. Heavy lift aircraft begin arriving with engineers, communications units, and sustainment supplies. What was a limited presence hours earlier expands into a continuous flow. Control stops being temporary and starts becoming structural. Greenland's scale works against it here. There are no alternate runways to fall back on, no secondary network to complicate planning. With these few nodes secured, access to the island is effectively monopolized. At this stage, the question is no longer whether Greenland can be entered. It has already been done. The remaining uncertainty lies offshore, whether outside powers can interfere before the situation hardens. That uncertainty shifts the focus from airfields to the sea. With the runway secured, the operation turns outward. Control of Greenland means little if outside powers can still reach it by sea. The decisive space is no longer on the island itself, but in the cold water surrounding it. Between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom lies a narrow corridor through which Arctic traffic must pass to reach the wider Atlantic. For decades, this gap has been monitored rather than sealed. In a crisis, that distinction disappears. The objective shifts from detection to denial. Submarines deploy first. Operating deep and quietly, they establish a layered presence that tracks movement without revealing position. Any vessel entering the corridor is identified long before it reaches Greenland's waters. The message is implicit. Proceed further, and escalation becomes unavoidable. Surface forces follow, not as an invasion fleet, but as a boundary. Carrier strike groups position themselves to provide air cover, command coordination, and logistical depth. Destroyers and escorts extend the perimeter, turning the corridor into a controlled space rather than an open passage. This is not a naval battle in the traditional sense. No fleets exchange fire. Instead, choices narrow. Russian or Chinese vessels approaching the area must decide whether to continue and openly challenge control or turn back and preserve ambiguity. Most scenarios end before confrontation begins. At the same time, sea control reinforces what has already been achieved on land. Amphibious ships move personnel and equipment directly to Greenland's limited ports, anchoring administrative authority. Supplies arrive without interference. The island's isolation now works in favor of the operation. By this point, the theater is effectively closed. Airspace is dominated. Sea approaches are managed. Greenland's critical nodes are held. Outside powers can observe the situation, but intervening would require a deliberate and visible escalation. With interference contained, the operation enters its most demanding phase. Not combat, but endurance. Holding Greenland does not depend on defeating an enemy. It depends on surviving the environment and sustaining control where roads do not exist. Once the theater is sealed, the nature of the operation changes. The primary threat is no longer an opposing force, but the environment itself. Greenland does not resist occupation with armies. It resists it with distance, cold, and logistics that punish every mistake. There are no roads connecting Greenland's settlements. Each town, base, and installation exists as an island of infrastructure surrounded by ice and rock. Movement between them depends entirely on airlift or sea transport. Every gallon of fuel, every replacement part, every meal must arrive from elsewhere. This reality dictates how forces are equipped. Heavy armored vehicles designed for paved roads and solid ground are liabilities here. Their weight risks sinking into thawing permafrost, and their maintenance demands strain already long supply lines. Lighter, more mobile platforms, built for snow, ice, and uneven terrain, become essential. Airlift becomes the lifeline. Transport aircraft cycle continuously through secured runways, bringing in supplies and rotating personnel. Engineers work to stabilize ground, reinforce structures, and adapt facilities to Arctic conditions. What looks like occupation from the outside feels more like constant maintenance on the inside. Civilian contractors play a critical role in this phase. They build shelters, maintain equipment, and keep systems running in temperatures that degrade machinery quickly. Their presence is not optional. Without them, control would erode within weeks. With them, temporary positions begin to harden. Over time, a rhythm emerges. Supply schedules stabilize. Facilities expand incrementally. The operation becomes less about movement and more about sustainment. Greenland is not conquered. It is managed day by day against an environment that never stops applying pressure. Yet even as the visible structure solidifies, the most fragile elements remain out of sight. Beneath the surrounding waters lies infrastructure that connects continents. If that layer fails, everything above it becomes irrelevant. Securing Greenland fully requires securing what cannot be seen. Far below the ice-choked waters around Greenland, the most consequential targets never break the surface. Fiber optic cables run across the seabed, carrying military coordination, financial transactions, and civilian communication between North America and Europe. They are rarely discussed, but they are indispensable. In a modern crisis, these cables represent leverage. An adversary does not need to challenge air patrols or naval blockades to create strategic shock. Interference at a few precise points could delay orders, fragment coordination, and isolate decision-makers at exactly the wrong moment. The effect would be immediate, even if the cause remained unclear. This is why securing Greenland is not complete without securing the seabed around it. Specialized teams deploy underwater drones and sensor arrays along known cable routes and landing points. Their mission is not dramatic, it is constant awareness, detecting presence early enough that interference never becomes action. Unlike visible defenses, this layer works quietly. There are no announcements, no show of force. Ships that approach too closely are tracked. Research activity is scrutinized. The goal is deterrence through certainty. The knowledge that any attempt to tamper with these systems would be noticed instantly. As this undersea security comes online, the operation crosses its true point of no return. Greenland is no longer just held by aircraft and ships. It is woven into a broader network that supports continental defense and global communication. Removing control now would require dismantling that network piece by piece. This is the moment when the operation stops looking temporary. What began as rapid action becomes structural reality. The island is no longer simply occupied, it is integrated, and integration changes the political calculus for everyone watching from the outside. With the most vulnerable layer secured, the final question is no longer how to take Greenland, but what happens after control becomes routine. That transition, from attack to permanence, is where the long game begins. At a certain point, momentum replaces urgency. The operation no longer feels like a race against interference, but a process of consolidation. What matters now is not how fast control was established, but how quietly it can be maintained. The shift begins with infrastructure. Airfields expand beyond immediate necessity. Hangars are reinforced, fuel storage increases, sensor arrays are integrated into broader air and missile defense networks. Greenland's facilities stop functioning as isolated outposts and start behaving like components of a continental system. Ports follow the same logic. Rather than building overtly military installations, development emphasizes dual-use capacity. Civilian shipping, research traffic, and supply vessels move through the same docks as naval assets. On paper, activity looks economic and administrative. In practice, it ensures rapid military access without visible escalation. This normalization matters. Presence framed as routine draws less resistance than presence framed as force. Over time, what once would have triggered political alarms becomes background activity. Control persists not because it is imposed daily, but because it no longer appears exceptional. Personnel levels stabilize. Smaller sites spread across the island to support communications, radar, and logistics. Each installation is modest on its own. Together, they form a dense web that is difficult to unravel without sustained effort. Reversal becomes impractical without deliberate escalation. By now, Greenland's role has fundamentally changed. It is no longer a remote buffer or a vulnerable gap. It functions as an early warning hinge, a logistics node, and a denial platform combined. Control of the island translates directly into control of the northern approaches. At this stage, the operations logic is complete, but it does not exist in isolation. Others are watching, calculating what this permanence means for their own options, and how they might respond within the limits they face. For China, Greenland presents a problem defined by distance. There are no nearby bases to fall back on, no established logistics network in the North Atlantic, and no routine military presence that could be scaled up quickly. Any overt move would expose those limitations immediately. Because of that, China's approach is fundamentally slower. Instead of force, it relies on familiarity. Research missions chart seabeds and ice conditions. Commercial projects explore ports, minerals, and transport routes. Each activity appears civilian, but each reduces uncertainty about operating in one of the world's harshest environments. Shipping routes shape these constraints. The Northern Sea Route depends heavily on Russian cooperation and icebreaker support. The Northwest Passage runs through Canadian waters, where NATO scrutiny is unavoidable. The Transpolar Route is the most direct, but still technically demanding and unreliable for sustained operations. None of them allow rapid power projection today. This forces a different kind of strategy. China does not need to arrive first with ships or aircraft. It needs to arrive early with data, relationships, and infrastructure that can later be repurposed. Influence is accumulated in advance of capability, so that when access improves, resistance is already complicated. For the United States, this slow approach is not reassuring. It creates a narrow window in which control can still be established cleanly. Once civilian projects, research norms, and economic ties take root, removing them later becomes politically costly and strategically messy. This contrast clarifies the deeper competition. The United States plans for speed because it has the means to act quickly. China plans for patience because it must. Both strategies converge on the same reality. Greenland's importance grows as the Arctic opens, and whoever defines the terms first shapes the environment for everyone else. The final pressure shaping every plan around Greenland is time. Not a deadline announced to the public, but a steady compression driven by technology, climate, and competition. Ice retreats earlier each year and returns later. Routes that once required exceptional effort begin to support routine movement. What was once remote becomes reachable. As access improves, presence becomes easier to sustain. That change lowers the threshold for action by any power willing to invest early. Greenland stops functioning as a natural buffer and starts behaving like contested infrastructure, valuable not for what it produces, but for what it enables. For the United States, this creates a stark calculation. Greenland underpins early warning, transatlantic communication, and the ability to see danger before it arrives. If that role is weakened, reaction time collapses. Decisions that once had minutes or hours are forced into seconds. Stability erodes without a single dramatic event. From this perspective, planning to seize and secure Greenland is not about conquest. It is about insurance. Allowing others to normalize presence first would mean accepting permanent uncertainty along the northern approaches. Acting later would require more force, more justification, and far greater disruption than acting early. This is why the logic of speed dominates every scenario. Each step is designed to settle the question of control before debate can catch up to reality. Control established early is easier to defend than control contested late. In this context, preparation is not aggression, it is risk management. By the time the story reaches this point, the answer to the title has already taken shape. The United States does not plan for Greenland because it wants to fight there. It plans because leaving that hinge unsecured would mean discovering the crisis only after time has run out.